prefixes, but he became my Uncle John became what they used to call a dollar a day man. You were making a lot of money at the United Fruit Company, and the deal was the United States government will protect the United Fruit Company. You will lend us this executive and pay a salary.
What does $1 a day man mean, really?
Well, there were people who were making, let's say, these days, the numbers would have been like $11 million a year. That was their income, right? And you lent them to the federal government for a crisis, and you literally charged them a nominal $1.
Oh.
So you took the CEO of Citicorp or J.P. Morgan, and you lent him as Secretary of the Treasury, and he didn't take his government salary, donated it to Treasury to charity, and he only asked to be paid $1. You don't have a contract in Anglo-Saxon law.
Oh, is this like the church? There's some land in New York, and the government rents it for $1 a year from the Catholic Church or some such. I've heard of that.
Rockefeller Center sits on land that's owned by the Diocese of the Catholic Church of New York.
No, okay.
There is nothing to prevent the folks who own the buildings, not the land, but own the buildings, from saying, we've been squatting here for more than 7 years. It's our land. So once a year, the Catholic Church puts a chain around Rockefeller Center and asks every pedestrian to, just for a minute, could you just stand there? At which point they've reestablished their ownership of the land. But in the case of the dollar, you think there are 3 requirements for any contract in Anglo-Saxon law. You have to have 2 parties.
And you have to have some money.
And you have to have some consideration, which is why you sometimes see for consideration of $1 hereby, receipt of which is hereby acknowledged, come. Otherwise, it's not a valid contract. Nothing of value has changed hands between the people. After all, you could imagine contemplating a contract, negotiating a contract, and you decide not to go through with it. And then someone wants to hold you to the contract that you never agreed to.
That happened to Elon Musk, though, right? But I don't know.
Well,
Let's
that's a side issue.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with our personal history here.
So then after Belgium, you went back to
Washington, D.C.
D.C., to Foxhall Road. But then what did he do in D.C., your dad? Just worked at the State Department?
No, he did several things which are important for people in the biz. There was something called the National War College at the ends of Haines Point. And there was also something called the Policy Planning Staff, which in those days was acting as an internal think tank as to what is our policy to Maoist China, to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, toward the British. For instance, the policy planning staff, which was only like 8 people, Dad was one, wrote some white papers, and one of them was at one point later in our history, the Colonel and now President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt basically seized the Suez Canal and told the British to go fuck themselves. And the French and the British and the Israelis got terribly upset about this, because after all, he was going to be able to put his thumb on the carotid artery of Israel, France, and Great Britain. And it was a little bit like Tsushima Straits. That's some fucking raghead Arab was telling 2 major colonial powers. And Israel is kind of similar to a colonial power. You know, a bunch of European Jews take over a place surrounded by a bunch of Arabs and use the superior technology and discipline and all the rest of that to defeat them. You know, seriously, within something like 6 months of declaring the state of Israel, Israel was the most powerful military force in the Near East. That was effective. And
What did your dad think about that?
he, in fact, was asked to come to the White House where Dwight David Eisenhower was president, and he was, as the guy who had written the white paper the president had seen, he had said, we need to remind the British that the history of the United States is we are a revolutionary country. We are opposed to colonials, and we're opposed to states that are headed in either autocratic forms or like by birthright, kings and such. And so before the Russian, and he said, and it's very urgent because otherwise the Soviet Union will take their side. So we basically said, and he made a public statement, he said, if you actually try to seize the Suez Canal by force, we have thermonuclear weapons that could in fact literally descend on Paris and London, and I'm not fucking kicking around. Get the hell out of there. At which point they felt, oh, they were stabbed in the back by the Americans. And I go like, there's a historic trajectory. You know, this kind of shit doesn't work anymore. Yeah. So there were a lot of things about Dad that I mean, how could you not admire? You admired the things he stood for,
And what he did in World War II,
the acts of principle he had shown,
the people he saved.
positioning the United States in terms of remember your history, and be on the right side. Also, he was very good at paying attention to details. I mean, he could do an input-output table of the economy of Japan in 1932 just from memory. How many tons of coal do you buy? How many tons of coal do you sell? How many steel do you make? How many tons of steel of a certain quality does it take to make a battleship like the Yamamoto? Dad knew all that shit. And he knew where it came from.
People were smart.
Yeah. People were smart, they were educated. And he was very inquisitive. In other words, he wouldn't just sort of look at those hills without sort of saying, what's the name of those hills?
And we'd say, no sabe.
And if you did, he'd say, that's fine. Today we are the 15th. By the first Monday of September, we'll have a monthly staff meeting. Make sure you know. And if you didn't, you could find yourself on a ship in those days, an airplane these days, back to Washington. He had a political officer in the embassy in Buenos Aires who was addressing letters to a foreign minister who'd been dead for 3 years.
Why?
Because he didn't know who the foreign minister of Argentina was.
Oh, no.
It's as though you work for the Russian ambassador in Washington, D.C., and you're writing letters to someone who is not the Secretary of State. Dear Secretary Clinton, she hasn't been Secretary of State for a long time. You know, Pompeo and all those other people.
What did your dad do when he found out?
So he stopped the letter from going out, and when they had the next Monday, first Monday of the month meeting, he said, before everyone even sat down, sort of said, I didn't let this mail go out because you addressed it to a foreign minister of this country, Argentina, who's been dead. And there was complete silence in his office. And he said, do you know who the foreign minister of Argentina is? And the guy blushed and turned red and stammered and said, no, he didn't. He said, okay, know it by the next meeting. So the next meeting rolled around 30 days later, and before the guy could even walk in the room, he said, who's the foreign minister of Argentina? The guy still didn't know.
Wow.
So he said, make sure everyone heard, he said, pack. I'm sending you back to Washington. So it's a huge hit to your career.
But he had 30 days to find out.
That's right. Yeah, and when Ambassador McClintock speaks, you fucking listen, and he's pretty goddamn careful and clear in his English language. He wasn't saying, well, it'd be good if you knew. No, I understand these Spanish names are hard to remember. No. He said, know who the foreign minister of this country is. Maybe like one of the generals who reported who did not know who the Chancellor of Germany was, or who the head of the German Bundeswehr or Luftwaffe or their delegation to NATO. What? These are people you interface all the time with, right? You can't say that out loud. That Russian? He's the guy? Oh, I didn't know. Who knew? And so many, many years later, I remember meeting in Washington to see a guy at the Metropolitan Club, which is a popular hangout for the foreign policy community of Washington, D.C. And he said, you Rob McClintock's son? I said, well, yes, I am. He said, your father ruined my career. He was the guy that I thought, I had, oh, I'm sorry, but my inclination is to say he probably had pretty good reasons. And he said, "You're absolutely right, I deserved it. Let me buy you a drink."
Oh, that's nice. At least you didn't like hit
No,
him.
right, exactly. So, just when you would hear little incidental side tales coming back to about Dad, boy, you just got prouder.
After,
I remember telling that story when I was in college to people who thought that was kind of harsh.
not
And I'm
really.
going like, there are things where if I was maintaining airliners and we fucked up and we damn near lost a hull and everybody on board for lack of,
Knowledge.
no, I can't afford that guy. It's pretty serious shit.